It is a great honor to welcome Gary Saul Morson onto this program. He is the professor of the arts and humanities at Northwestern University. He recently published a book titled Wonder Confronts Certainty: Russian Writers on the Timeless Questions and Why Their Answers Matter. Thank you for joining the show, Gary. How are you doing?
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Mhm. So my first question is, um, having gone through 1 year of the Russian-Ukraine war, um, can you compare and contrast the Russian historiography in regards to Ukraine and vice versa, Ukraine's historiography when it comes to Russia?
I'm not sure what you're asking. Can I give you the different points of view of the two countries? Is that
How Russia viewed Ukraine historically and how Ukraine viewed Russia historically.
wow? Well, this is not a question that's touched on in my book at all, um, which is about timeless issues rather than
Mhm.
timely ones. but I'll do the best I can. Uh, Russians Russians vary and Ukrainians vary like everybody else, but um, the current policy reflects an idea that Russia includes all the lands that go back to what was called ancient Rus, which was before there was a separate Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, when there was just one people, they hadn't divided yet, and one language. And the Russians think of themselves as the heir to that ancient root, which was in Kiev, actually, which was in the ancient capital. And they think of themselves as the heir, to all of us. So it's one people, and it should be, one country, naturally dominated from Moscow because it's the biggest, right? Um, of course, the Ukrainians, don't like to refer to that country as of the ancient times as Old Rus, although that's what they did then, because it suggests it's part of Russia today, and they think of themselves since the time that they developed an identity, which was several centuries later, as as separate. Of course, not all Ukrainians think that way. Some do identify as part of as Russians. That's why the Russians are able to exploit that division. Um, but the dominant view is that they became a separate country with a separate literature and they view their language as a completely separate language, whereas the Russians tend to see it as a dialect of Russian. Um, uh, and Ukraine has never, for except for very short periods of time, been an independent country. Um, they tried to set up an independent country during the Russian Civil War that followed the Russian Revolution, but um, Kiev changed hands, I don't know, 30 or 40 times. I don't know the exact number, between the whites and the reds and various Ukrainian nationalist groups and various anarchist groups. There's the novel by Mikhail Bulgakov, White Guard, describes this in very interesting detail. Um, and, you know, now what they have an independent country since the collapse of the USSR. And of course, they want to keep it, whereas, of course, the Russians think of that as a historical accident, and they want to restore what they think of as the proper Russian kingdom. You know, and places in Ukraine figure so prominently in Russian history. For example, in fighting the Nazis and um, the expansion of the empire and Catherine the Great. A lot of that territory, particularly in Crimea, was ruled by Muslim kingdoms who would raid Russia and take, you know, tens of thousands of slaves, which they would sell in the Middle East. Um, and eventually the Russians conquered it, and so that naturally plays a role to think that this is Russian territory they've conquered. Um, so you can see it you can see it from both points of view, I suppose. Um, Naturally, Ukrainians, their nationalism is particularly fed by the fact of what happened to them under Soviet rule. Um, when they and the Kazakhs were the principal victims of the campaign to um, collectivize agriculture. And one of the ways in which the Soviet government broke resistance was to have an enforced starvation campaign on peasants, taking the lives by starvation. That is, Bolshevik troops were sent there to prevent any food from getting in, to prevent people from fishing in the rivers, taking the lives of millions. The whole collectivization campaign took many, many millions of lives. Um, Ukrainians view this, as a genocide. Depends on how you define genocide. Obviously, was it an attempt to wipe out all Ukrainians? Well, probably not all of them, but certainly they were very profligate with the life of them. And there was certainly an attempt to wipe out an independent Ukrainian culture. That is, they were arresting, professors of Ukrainian language. um, Say it happened in Kazakhstan. Even even a higher percentage of people, or lower absolute number, were killed by that method. But if you've gone through something like that, um, you realize that, well, the people from Moscow can do things to you beyond simply occupy the territory. I mean, they can do things beyond our imagination of what is possible. Um, so, from the Ukrainian point of view, it becomes potentially, at least, an existential threat, to their very lives, not just to who's, going to set the tax rates, right? So, um, whereas again, if you switch from a Russian point of view, again, none of this is in my book, which is not about that. And, if you switch from a Russian point of view, when they claim that their opponents are Nazis, they're not using the term Nazi in the way you and I would think. Nazi for them simply becomes, the Nazis are sort of the prototypical enemy of Russia, because they did actually want to wipe out all Russians. It was an existential threat, to Russians. The siege of Leningrad was not supposed to capture Leningrad; it was supposed to just raise it. They view, all wars against Russia as in those terms, and therefore, for them, the West's support of Ukraine is like the Germans, invasion. And do they really believe this? I don't know what to say. I don't know. Honestly, don't know. But that's what the propaganda is. Obviously, some people believe it. I mean, so it's very hard to imagine compromise when a war is defined not as a battle for territory or for control, even political control, but your very existence, which is how both sides see it, and both sides justify it by it that way. Did I help at all? I mean, you know, and but it's and then you get, once you realize that, then you understand not only the position of the Ukrainians and the Russians, let's say the Poles, who they would be next. So their strong support of Ukraine comes from, they've been under Soviet rule and Russian rule before that themselves. So it's really clear why they are in the forefront of helping the Ukrainians, because they know they'd be next, right?
So, the great Russian novelist and dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn says that he himself is a Russian nationalist and patriot, even though he is vehemently against communism. So, I wonder what are some of the key elements that Solzhenitsyn believes that are unique to the Russian nation, and is Soviet communism a deviation of Russian history and civilization, or a continuation of
it? Wow, those are complicated questions with no easy answers. Solzhenitsyn is a very odd figure. If he's a nationalist, he's a very odd nationalist, because if you go back to the Soviet period, when of course they controlled all 15 republics, Solzhenitsyn wanted the Soviet government to let these republics go. And as he thought imperialism was very bad for the Russian character. Now, it's a very peculiar, to call somebody who thinks you should get rid of your empire a nationalist is a very peculiar use of the term nationalist. Okay, so what we think of as nationalist is not what he was. He did, however, believe deeply in, the welfare of the Russian people, which he thought was a matter of its spiritual health. And he viewed communism with its definition of morality as, um, well, this was the communist definition of morality: whatever works is moral, and if you're immoral if you don't do it, that is, the more cruel you are to your enemy, the better you are. Cruelty was actually a virtue, compassion a vice. And so, 74 years of this, he thought had damaged severely the Russian soul. And the crucial thing for Russia was nothing else would matter, not economics, nothing, was to restore the spirituality of the Russian people. Um, so, fighting a war for territory he thought was a really bad idea, and holding on to territory. Now, he did think that, it being, from Ukraine himself and Russian, that it would be better if Ukraine and, Belarus were part of the same country, not Kazakhstan and the rest. But he vehemently opposed the use of any force, to do it. He thought, well, we hope that they would choose to be part of us, but that's up to them. Was his, was his position. He did not want, by any circumstances, places like Lithuania or Kazakhstan to be, except, maybe the areas of Kazakhstan that are overwhelmingly Russian. But he didn't think imperialism was a good idea, because, well, look what it did to Russia. It changes your morality, in a really bad way. And, you understand Solzhenitsyn best if you see him as a person who thinks this is not like Westerners, right? What makes a country well off is not primarily its economic or political power, but its spiritual health. This is what he really believes. This is not some propaganda that he's using. This is his deepest conviction, right? And so to call that a nationalist, well, in the sense in which he's a nationalist, but not in the sense we usually use the term.
I guess after the Soviet Union fell down, Solzhenitsyn was kind of a fan of Putin, if I'm not mistaken, in that yeah, he likes what Putin represents, and if he was alive today, Solzhenitsyn would likely be more supportive to Putin's war in Ukraine than not.
I don't agree with that at all. I mean,
Okay.
the war in Ukraine would have been, this is an imperialist war killing people. I mean, that's how he would have viewed it. And when Putin took over, it was not clear that he was, an autocrat, undemocratic. He came in as Yeltsin's, choice. People thought, okay, this is the guy who was going to have democracy, but without the chaos and, poverty and corruption of the Yeltsin period. And a lot of people thought that would be the case. A lot of people who changed their minds soon afterwards, but it did look that way for a short time. I never thought so, but then I have a generally pessimistic view of Russian history. But a lot of well-intentioned people did think so, and it didn't mean they would have liked what Putin became. It meant that it wasn't clear what he was going to become when he first took over. I think it should have been clear, but it wasn't. I mean, and to a lot of people who were Russian experts in the West, there were a handful who saw what was going to happen, like the journalist David Satter, who was not only expelled from the Soviet Union, but was the first journalist to be expelled from Putin's Russia, Western journalist, right? And he was very clear from day one what Putin represented. But people I know who are very good at understanding Russia and Russian culture. For example, Strobe Talbot, who was President Clinton's Russian advisor, did not see it quite. It did not see either Yeltsin or initially Putin that way, right? we had hope. I think the hope was misplaced, and it turned out that way. But
Well, so when I was introduced to you and your work via the April issue of Commentary magazine, which you have an article that served as the cover piece. Um, the question is, do Russians worship war? Um, I suppose upon finishing the article, I don't see a clear answer of yes or no, but I do recognize that unlike Americans who had never been conquered by any other population historically, that is a constant reality in the history of Russia. And that's why their views on war are much more tragic and pessimistic, but nevertheless, they put a premium on sacrifices. Would that be correct?
yes, I think that's right. I mean, the title, "Do Russian Worship War?" When you write these articles, the one thing you cannot control is what title they put on it. That's the magazine puts that, right? Um, I've sometimes been very surprised at the titles that get put to my articles. Uh, I don't know if they worship war, but the thing to be most understand is that that Americans have very difficult is that there are people in the world who do not see life the way Americans do. Americans have the same. Well, we all value the same thing. We all think that you know, and they just can't visualize someone radically different. Well, of course, if they're like us, what else would you be like, right? But Russians are not at all like that, and there are some reasons given in their history or in their history of their culture. But for Russians, unlike Americans, an attitude to war, a feeling about war, is essential to their identity as Russians. Americans, what makes them Americans? Well, to begin with, they would find the question, in many cases, peculiar. But if they didn't, I don't know, they might say, our form of government, various ideals they might have. You know, I don't know exactly what they would say, but they would not say it's our attitude to war. Right? Um, the biggest holiday in Russia is May 9th, which is the day that they finally defeated the Germans. Right? And it's the day. This is now. I've asked Americans, well, so what do you think about the date May 9th? Almost nobody who's not a specialist either in World War II or Russia has any idea what happened on May 9th, right? Well, what about what we used to call VE, Victory in Europe Day? Unless you're at least my age, you've never heard these terms, right? You know, World War II doesn't figure as part of the American identity. Nazis figure as a symbol of evil, but not World War II specifically, right? I mean, and they, it's in the past. What difference, does it make? You don't think of yourself that way. But Russians, you know, nobody quite knows how many people they lost or how many, they lost because of, the way Stalin fought the war. But it certainly was well over 20 million people, which means, you know, Soviet population then was about, I don't know, 200 million. So that's 1 in 10 people. Everybody lost, and maybe more than 20 million people. Everybody, and by the way, in Ukraine too, it suffered particularly bad. They it's part of their experience too. That was part of the Soviet Union. Um, you know, it becomes essential to who you are. And then the Russians tend to read this existential conflict back, and they've been invaded many times, from the east and the west, right? The Mongols ruled Russia for 240 years, right? Of course, they were not, trying to wipe Russians out. In fact, their rule was comparatively gentle. All they were interested in was extracting tribute, right? I mean, for 240 years. Um, and the Russian church flourished in that period as never before or since, right? They didn't care about wiping out Russian religion, but the Russians read the history back, and forward, so that all wars are like the wars against the Nazis. And so, if you are not pro-military, let's say, I don't know. All I could think of is it's like if you're not pro-military for a Russian, it would be like an American thinking, that slavery was a good thing. It's just morally impossible. Okay. Um, uh, but for Americans, no war plays that role. And then you gave part of the reason that Americans have been invaded. But even invasion would not be sufficient. A Nazi invasion was something rather um, different from, I don't know, the Germans taking Schleswig-Holstein from the Danes. I mean, that's a sort of whole different kind of war, right? I mean,
Mhm. So, with that in mind, do Russians truly believe that what the Americans are doing, what NATO is doing, is tantamount to an invasion by a foreign population?
that's a really good question. I don't know the answer. Certainly, the regime is trying to persuade people of that. And all right, I'm thinking of now an American analogy. Do Americans really think that Donald Trump was a Russian agent? I don't know the answer to that. It was so ridiculous on the surface, and there was never any evidence. Do they really? But they'll say it
Mhm,
because you don't break the party line.
mhm,
Okay, right? You don't break the party line, no matter what the evidence is. You don't break. That's kind of how I imagine Russians are reacting to is NATO fighting this war to destroy us. But I don't really know. But that's my guess. I mean, that's how they look at it. I mean, um, you don't say you don't give aid and comfort to the enemy by saying it's not true.
mhm.
Do you really believe it? You see, you don't even ask if you believe it. You know what you're supposed to say, and you don't dig any deeper. That's my guess to psychology.
I think if Trump truly is a Russian agent, then Russia is stupider than we thought.
Well, you know, this is really interesting. What that shows in America is that the word Russia has gone back. Is when I grow up. Russian meant evil when I was growing up because it was communism. That, you know, we're back to that. Only now it's the left that tends to use that rather than the right. But it's the same kind of. I never thought I'd see that, right? Um, but you know, it's really Russia can play that role in many Western countries. Kind of a symbol of evil. Um, and it's not entirely groundless, of course, right? But it becomes irrational, in some cases, uh, and kind of mirrors the Russians' own, you know, attitude. That doesn't mean they're not dangerous, but it means you got to be careful when somebody says someone's a Russian agent or this is a Russian plot or something like that. Well, look, there were Russian plots, but you need more evidence than that. Right? Um,
So, in the commentary article you wrote, quote, far from fighting a war against Russian culture, we should be encouraging Russians to define it differently. In the Russian imagination, only one thing competes in importance with war, and that is Russian literature. As I explain in my forthcoming book, Being Wonder Confronts Certainty, no country in the world has valued literature more than Russia, and Russians consider this fact essential to who they are. And and more. In a review of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, Dostoevsky himself suggested that at last the existence of the Russian people had been justified by its publication. So tell me more about what Dostoevsky meant by that remark.
yeah, it's think of it. The existence of the Russian people has at last been justified. Could you imagine a Frenchman or a German or an Englishman thinking the existence of France or Germany or Russia required justification? Right? Of course not. It was not a question. But Russians, did have that view. And then if they did ask that question in France or England, would they pick literature as the reason why they're You know, I can imagine an American picking, you know, the internet or Coca-Cola or something like that. You know, I don't know. Maybe in England they could pick them. They might pick the Magna Carta, right? Um, but the literature. I mean, but in Russians that is really really true. um, you know, well, I have a whole chapter devoted, you know, to how the extraordinary hopes they put in literature, the faith they put in literature. Um, Americans might think, well, you know, if I said to my students, well, literature exists to reflect life, they would all nod, oh, yes, literature exists to reflect life. Russians are more likely to think life exists to be made into literature, right? That is, the world exists to create great art, and the art that matters most is literature. So, you know, writer, well, you know, the writer, late 19th century writer, humanist writer, Karolinska, was once asked, well, you're half Ukrainian, Karolinska's Ukrainian name, and half Russian. Um, how do you identify? And he replied, and this was a way that, you know, very characteristic, my homeland is Russian literature, not Russian literature. And, you know, the recent Nobel Prize winner, Svetlana Alexievich, right, whose work is wonderful, I think, you know, she was asked similar, except she's part Belarusian and part Ukrainian, but writes in Russian. And again, she gave the same answer. I identify with Russian literature. Right? I mean, that sense of, you know, the importance of literature. If you, in the 19th century, if you wanted to talk about a philosophical question, a political question, the meaning of life, um, the nature of knowledge, you could write a treatise, of course, but more likely you would write either a novel or literary criticism about a novel. So all the big questions are talked about. You know, even scientists, like in the 1860s, there was this wonderful scientist named Ivan Sechenov, who developed what we would now call the neurological theory of the mind. It's not, it's neurons firing, right? 1862, he already has this idea. Because Russians take things to an extreme. He tries to publish this theory originally in a journal for literary criticism. Why? Because then people would take it seriously as something more than obscure scientific discovery. You know, this is what we have to talk. And he did get it, you know, broadcast. You know, in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, one of the characters quotes in this theory. He doesn't quote his name, but quotes the theory. Gee, maybe I don't have a soul. Maybe I just have neurons firing here. You know, that's his theory right now. You know, and the novels deal with these ultimate questions. And that's their, you know, that's what life is about. In the Soviet period, it became even more the case, both for the regime, you know, with its socialist realist novels, and you know, for the dissidents who published this amazing literature, which they thought of as continuing the great humane tradition of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Chekhov, and it did, right? But the strange thing is, even the regime viewed literature with an intense importance. You know, they tried to create this awful socialist realism. So there's this wonderful story. I give some more details about when the novelist Mikhail Sholokhov was having trouble publishing one of his novels. He wrote to Stalin, you know, about the difficulty of it. And to his surprise, some weeks later, he got summoned to the Kremlin, and there was not just Stalin, but the head of the army and the person directing the whole Soviet economy, and I forget who else, top officials. And Stalin had read the novel and offered a detailed critique, and basically told, and he had his top officials there to hear what he had to say, and he told them, you can publish a novel, but you have to change the title. Okay. I can't imagine the most educated American president, I don't know, John Kennedy, Barack Obama, spending their time reading a novel and having official policy. No, why would they do that? No one would think it's important. But this is Stalin we're talking about, right? We think of Stalin as a as an illiterate thug. He was nothing of the sort. I mean, he had a library of something like 10,000 books, which he selected himself and developed his own catalog system for, right? He was at one time going to be a poet himself. I mean, he really, I mean, I think he did terrible things to Russian literature, but he did value its importance in a way that, shocks people when I tell them that, this was the case, because they think, I mean, Stalin valuing literature sounds like, Donald Trump spending his time reading romantic poetry. It doesn't fit, right? But it's true, right? So that's one of the great things about Russian culture. And I value the other arts, as well. Ballet is very important, and music, but literature is in a class by itself, and that's one of the great things about Russian culture. And of course, what I was trying to say is, all around the world, there was this reaction to the invasion by saying, let's cancel all our Tchaikovsky concerts, let's cancel Russian art exhibits, Columbia University Press in New York suspended its series of translations of Russian literature. This is mad. This is simply crazy, right? I mean, first of all, the idea that Tolstoy or Dostoevsky or Pushkin are to blame for what's happening now. I mean, if that's the case, what are we to blame for what's going to happen to 200 years ago in 2 years from now in our country? We don't know. It's just nonsense, right? But what's more important is that you want the Russians to pick that part of their tradition and not, we are the victims of Nazis as their defining characteristic. So you don't, on the contrary, you want to encourage them to, and that's in the Cold War, Americans were smarter than that, right? I mean, in the Cold War is when Americans first started establishing the study of Russian language and Russian culture, right? I mean, that's how I wound up doing it, right? It wouldn't have been possible 20 years, before. It didn't exist. That's when this became important, because you want to understand another people. That's a much more intelligent view than, well, if it's Russian, it's evil. Let's cancel that pianist. But I guess it's a carryover from the general American attitude of cancel culture, just with canceling another thing. But it's counterproductive, because you really want the Russians to think of themselves as, the people of Chekhov, not the people of Putin, right?
Well, I once heard that the simplest way to compare the Shakespearean tragedy with the Chekhovian tragedy is that in the Shakespearean tragic vision, everyone gets what they want, but everyone dies horribly. In the Chekhovian tragic vision, no one gets what they want, everyone ends up disappointed, unhappy, but they still live at the end of the play. So, with that in mind, what is the Chekhovian tragic vision, or how does it reflect upon how Russians in general view tragedy or view such events as tragic?
That's really another interesting play. Well, I mean, if you ask Chekhov that question, he would say, no, my plays are not tragedies, they're comedies, right? And they were called comedy, right? And the way you can tell that a director understands Chekhov is if he brings out the humor. If he does it the way you describe, then he's not doing Chekhov, but what he thinks of is his view of Chekhov. I'm sorry. Chekhov was one of those people who thought that when people think of life in terms of grand tragedy, grand epic, they are misunderstanding life. Life is about the ordinary things, the small things that, epics and tragedies pay no attention to. It's about basic decency and kindness to others. It's about, avoiding self-deception, the things that don't make great dramas. That's why the Chekhov plays don't have much of a plot. Someone said one of his play, The Three Sisters. The only thing that happens in The Three Sisters is that three sisters do not go to Moscow, right? And that, most plays, dramas were supposed to be dramatic, right? And, there's always supposed to be action. Chekhov produced plays where the characters act dramatically. They want there to be act. They act like actors in a play, except they're not in a normal play. They're in a world, in the real world, something like the real world, where they're wanting to act dramatically is fake. You know what I'm saying? It's histrionics. It's building themselves up. And so what will be a serious action in a tragedy becomes ridiculous, right? In the Chekhov play. But the question of Shakespeare tragedy and how Russians viewed it, it's really in the 20th century. You get, let's say, comments like Solzhenitsyn's, or the theorist Mikhail Bakhtin has a similar comment, that Shakespeare did not understand evil. His view of evil was hopelessly naive.
Mm-hmm.
The worst Shakespearean villain, Macbeth, Iago, they never are responsible for more than a few deaths, a handful. Whereas, Lenin and Stalin killed millions and millions, right? What made that? That's where really the sort of evil you get, that Solzhenitsyn described, it seems childish in Shakespeare. Right? Also, Shakespearean evildoers are the ones like Iago who think, oh, I just love doing evil, right? That's nonsense. The real evildoers think they're doing good. That's what makes it possible for them to torture people and go home and sleep, because they think they're doing it for a higher purpose, like, the triumph of Marxism, Lenin, or something like that. You don't understand evil if you think they sit around like, like evil people in the Spider-Man or Superman comics, rubbing their hands and doing evil. And that's how Shakespeare presents it. And so, although many wonderful things in Shakespeare's understanding of evil, I think, is shallow.
So I came across an essay which you wrote for First Things, and it's titled "What Pilate Learns." Pilate being Pontius Pilate, and it's a summary and review of the Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, and you focus a lot on what Pontius Pilate was going through, or what Bulgakov describes what Pilate must have been going through when he sentenced Christ to death. And in some sense, he makes Pilate a less ambiguous character than what scriptures make of him, in that he's a reluctant character who was forced by these Pharisees to do what he did. But Bulgakov says that Pilate had a choice, and he chose to do evil. Is that correct?
It's not so much that the novel is one of the great comic novels of of the world. I've never read a person who didn't love it. Make sure if you read it, you read it in the right translation, the Bergen O'Connor translation. Others don't bring out the humor very well, but it's got three stories in it. One of which is the devil visits Moscow and plays a lot of philosophical, practical jokes on the citizens there who think, with Marxism, they understand everything. They don't really understand anything. And within the novel, there's a novel within the novel, which is the story, the gospel story, except told not about Jesus, but with the central character being Pontius Pilate. And the author of that story, who's called the Master, and his love, Margarita, then have their own story, which is told. So, the story of Pilate is one of the three stories. And, whereas the Moscow story is all fantastic, this is told realistically. So it's as if a realist novelist were telling this story, which is not how the gospel tells it at all, right? So that you get real psychology, you get political machinations of the sort that, would not have interested the gospel authors, right? Pilate is, knows what he should do, but he doesn't want to risk his career. He doesn't want to get into trouble. But this guy's just mad anyway. his sin is a lack of courage, right, to do the right thing. Now you can imagine, in the Soviet period, that how important that was. Everyone was lacking courage, and he's going to regret it for all eternity in the in the other world, right? Um, but it's perfectly understandable why he does that. Perfectly understandable. It's not entirely clear that any of us would have done any different, right? That's what makes it so wonderfully done. Um, but the, the author breaks in. His head of his secret police comes to him and said that Jesus' last words on the cross were that cowardice is one of the worst of sins. And then Bulgakov interrupts later to say, I disagree. It is the worst of sins, right? And that's Pilate's problem there, right? In many other respects, very admirable character, right? But it focuses on the value of courage, right? So that I think how how it's an absolutely brilliant and subtle novel, and that's one of the things about the here's a regime whose first principle was atheism and wiping out religion and the evil of religion, and three of its greatest, arguably the three greatest, literary works that it produced were all Christian, right? Explicitly Christian. This book, Dr. Zhivago, and Solzhenitsyn's Gulag, where it describes his own conversion at some point, right? Um, maybe that's not an accident. Maybe seeing, I mean, the conclusions, Russians take things to an extreme, so they really pursue to the end what it means to think that the world is nothing but material, natural causes, which means human beings are no different from rocks. Ultimately, we're governed by law. What does that do to morality? The Soviets actually were willing to actually take that to its logical extreme, as atheists generally don't anywhere, right? But they did. And maybe that's the reason why seeing what it produced is what produced, and if you want to take a fourth, great novel, Grossman's Life and Fate. Grossman is not a Christian; he's Jewish, but he affirms the existence of moral absolutes that cannot be reduced to natural laws. So it's a similar kind of conclusion, right? Even if it's not explicitly Christian. Um, and that's absolutely fascinating. I think how it would work out that way. We don't take things to the extreme. There's a passage in my favorite English novel, Middlemarch, where the author says, about the character with radical beliefs. But the nice thing about English society is that people don't actually. They may profess radical beliefs, but they live the same way as anyone else and don't actually, do anything. So that people around them would detect, no scorching, as she puts it, right? Russians are the exact opposite. They take everything to the radical extreme, right? Which is why philosophical and moral questions you can see their ultimate conclusion because they actually take them to their ultimate conclusions. Um, so that's one of the things, and then Russian writers react to that, and that's one of the reasons that Russian literature is so good at dealing with ultimate questions, right? In a way that no other literature is. I mean, that's its great characteristic.
You did open the pilot essay with no doctrine was more fundamental to the Bolsheviks than atheism. They profess absolute certainty that nothing exists beyond the chain of cause and effect described by the sciences. I think you can see that in both Russian literature in the 19th century, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and the like, and after the Bolsheviks take over, Bulgakov, Solzhenitsyn, Pasternak. The influence of Christianity, especially Orthodox Christianity, looms large in the literary imagination, and I suppose in the general Russian imagination too. So how how is the Christian Orthodox faith like plays itself into I guess, Russian and Russian literary traditions, his conception of himself?
That's an interesting question. When Russians will very often say, "Oh, the Orthodox faith," but they have in mind. I'm talking about the great writers. Something more generally Christian. They're Orthodox. They call it Orthodoxy, but you know, the Orthodox Church was, as today as in the past, was highly corrupt, right? I mean, it was simply a tool of the government, right? Um, amazingly enough, in the 19th century, uh, if a priest heard of something from a confession that was of interest to the government, he had to pass it on. That is violating the seal of. No, that couldn't happen in a Catholic country. Right? Confession was sacred, right? And of course, in the Soviet period, all the leaders of the church were secret police agents, right? Insofar as it existed at all, right? Um, so when people like Pastor Nag are thinking of Christianity, they're thinking of what we would really think of as Christianity, the Gospel of Matthew and things like that. They call it orthodoxy because that's what they are. They may even find some reason to find some doctrinal point in which the Eastern Church is preferable to the Western Church. But it's a Christianity that strikes one not by its specific orthodoxy, but by its deep spirituality. It has the it's as if St. Francis had become a novelist. I mean, that's kind of the feel it has.
Mhm. Right. So when Solzhenitsyn came to America and he made that speech at Harvard College, it triggered a massive uproar because I believe people were expecting him to be more praiseworthy of American government and democracy and society, but instead he was highly critical of it. So, what is it that the great Solzhenitsyn see in American society that displeases him?
Yeah, and it wasn't just criticism of American society. It was criticism of the American intelligentsia. Okay, this is at Harvard. He's talking. Um, and there are two things that he really finds difficult about America. For one thing, they really do not understand what's wrong with socialism and Marxism because it's still very fashionable. And he has one of us says, this is going to disable you from actually confronting and preventing it from happening in your own country. I hope the time doesn't happen when you're going to have to, be arrested and raise your hands. But the way you are going, you will. Okay, he wants to shake Americans to really believe in their values. Okay, and see how contrary they were to everything that Marxism, let's say, represented. Marxism still is, right? Um, and the second thing is, and would be characteristic of Russians for 200 years, he was repelled by the American tendency to define life in material terms, in terms of prosperity and wealth, and what you have, and that kind of completely unspiritual view of the world, right? And how that devalues life, and that it doesn't get what life is all about. And those are the two things he's really criticizing here. And of course, imagine all these Harvard professors. It was the agitation of American intellectuals and European intellectuals that had gotten him out of the Soviet Union, gotten him free, and now he's criticizing them. What a betrayal! You can imagine their point of view easily enough. But his answer to that was, you have to stop thinking of yourself the way American intellectuals do as the center of existence, that your values are the only true value, right? And that nobody dares to, because you're the superior people of the world. If people don't agree with you, then they have to learn something. You have to stop thinking of yourself. And he, particularly in one of his, essays, he quotes, some Canadian journalist who says, well, you don't really you come from a strange place that is, doesn't have the essence of what's going on, just just those gulags and all this. And Solzhenitsyn replied, and yes, and you think you really understand life because you are in a place where your newspapers are about the stock market and, this kind of thing, right? But in fact, you're the ones who are shallow here. We who have seen evil, you have something to learn from us as well as we from you. It goes both ways, right? But, I find, it's very odd, even now. I know Americans who profess to be multicultural expect, by multicultural, they mean other people should accept American multiculturalism, not their own cultures, but American multicultural, or else there's something. It's the same kind of, cultural egocentrism. That's what Solzhenitsyn is talking about. The sense that if we believe it, then it's the sum, of existence. And places like Yale and Harvard, it's even, more. I'm a Yale graduate myself, so I can tell you that I've been struck, since I got my degree and came back, that if you go back and mention some idea or philosopher they're not talking about at Yale, they think, it can't be very important, or we'd be talking about it. Yes, those people out there in the Midwest, they can talk about these things, but what matters is what we talk about here in New Haven or Cambridge or maybe Princeton, right? It's that same kind of narrowness that thinks it's superior. That's what is infuriating Solzhenitsyn at the time, and understandably so, right? Because it is very provincial.
So,
And I'm not sure it's unique to American universities, but it's there.
so Dostoevsky writes a lot about atheism in that there are prominent atheist characters in his novels, Raskolnikov and Ivan Karamazov. They are both depicted as highly intellectual persons who believes who believes in the supremacy of reason over faith, and they both met with tragic endings. And I'm not sure if Dostoevsky was aware of Friedrich Nietzsche at the time. They may have lived in the same period of time.
Nietzsche knew some Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky heard of Nietzsche.
But
Nietzsche
the
admired Dostoevsky quite a bit. A little he had read.
but yeah, the atheist characters of Dostoevsky are very much Nietzschean in their philosophy. And I think if we place Dostoevsky and Nietzsche in the same room, they would likely agree or understand the other, except for one thing. Dostoevsky believes that Christianity is necessary, while Nietzsche believes that it's just hogwash and that stops the strong from exercising their strength and all that. So, tell us more about atheism in the view of Dostoevsky.
Well, what's really interesting about, let's say, Ivan Karamazov is that, as Dostoevsky prevents him at the beginning, he actually, his view is more complex than just atheism. Atheism is a part of it, but he's torn, you see, between two opposing beliefs. He knows they're contradictory, and he accepts them both, and he can't reconcile them. One belief is the world is nothing but, natural laws, and he studied science. But if that's true, there's no such thing as good and evil. I mean, if I drop a stone, it falls at 9.8 meters per second squared. Is that moral or immoral? Question makes no sense. But if all we are the same complex stones governed by the same natural laws, then moral questions are simply absurd. I mean, they're culturally relative, they're done for certain purposes, but they have no essence, right? And yet, that's one set of beliefs Ivan has. But the other set of beliefs, he has seen, as we discover, the suffering and torture of children. He describes it in a way that has never been described before, right? And he simply knows it's evil. He can't reconcile those two, nor can he give up either one. And that's the self-division that propels him, through the plot. And something similar is already that in Raskolnikov too. He has a moral side, even though he professes complete amorality, right? Which we see when he, his moments of compassion And then he laughs at his moments of compassion. Why did I do that? I don't believe in it. In Karamazov, it's developed even more. And indeed, when I talk to when my students read this, if I ask them, well, do you believe completely in the world governed by natural law? And they'll say yes. And do you believe there's something that's just plain evil, not just culturally relevant? They'll say yes. How do you reconcile the two? And they sit there and I think, you're right. There's a problem there, but they've never thought of it. They've held these two beliefs, separate parts of their mind. But when they read Russian literature, they realize they have to think more deeply about both. Right?
Mm-hmm. Well,
So you wouldn't have thought about it otherwise.
right. So, final question. The Russian literary imagination when it comes to death and mortality is especially interesting to me. I have yet had the opportunity to read Tolstoy's very long novels, Era Karenina and War and Peace, but I got the fortune of reading The Death of Ivan Ilyich, and the story follows a very unremarkable man who died an unremarkable death. But moments before his death, he realized that, oh my God, I've been living an unremarkable life all my life. And there's another Chekhov short story. I believe the English title is "The Man in a Case," which also
The
follows,
man in the cave.
which also follows a man who lives a rather unremarkable life, who believes that he himself lived a much more remarkable life than everybody else, and then he died an unremarkable death. So this is also a difference between Shakespeare's tragedy, and that death is somewhat glorified, and Romeo and Juliet's death changes everything. The feud between the Montague and the Capulets are suddenly dispersed, and they become friends now. But in the minds of Tolstoy and Chekhov, death is just a fact, and nothing really happens uh, to you, or not. The war is not made better or worse after you die.
Well, what's really interesting about um, Ivan Ilyich is that we all know abstractly we're going to die, right? But that's an abstract knowledge. It's very different when suddenly you become ill and realize not people in general are dying, that people are mortal. I am. And the whole story is about, and everyone else around him, of course, does think and says, well, they're not dying. That's just an abstraction, right? And so he's incredibly alone when he realizes he really is dying, right? And the difference between really understanding the implications of your own mortality, all of culture and the way the story describes a series of curtains to prevent us from facing the real implications of mortality, right? And yet, Ivan Ilyich is, most of us will have to face it at some time, unless we, are shot suddenly and die before we can think about it, right? We're going to face it. And if you don't face it, you're lying to yourself about the essential quality of life, and therefore you cannot really understand life's meaning. That's the core idea, right? He has another wonderful story late in his life, a non-realist story called "What People Live By," or sometimes translated "What Men Live By," and it deals with an angel who is supposed to take the soul of a woman who's dying, but takes pity on her because she has these newborn babies and lets her live, and God decides to teach him a lesson. And the lesson is he has to go down and live on earth as a human being until he learns what people live. And I won't give the whole story away, but what he learns is that you do not understand the most fundamental things about life unless you understand what makes people not like angels. Because angels are immortal, people die, right? Because people, that changes everything. People suffer in a way angels don't. So their compassion for each other has a meaning that it wouldn't if they were immortal, right? And he has to understand morality, charity, kindness. And by the end of the story, he does, right? But it's all premised on that you cannot understand the essence of life unless you understand mortality as essential. Not just, oh, we happen to die, right? Yeah, we're going to have this nice life, and that's its meaning, then we're going to die. No, no. It's the dying is essential to it. And unless you get how that works, your life will be superficial. And you may realize it at the very last moment when you're actually dying, or you may not, but it will be superficial. That's, Tolstoy is sometimes referred to as the poet of death because he thought about, he was obsessed with them, maybe the great death in world literature is the death of the hero of War and Peace. Prince Andrei takes like 80 or 90 pages, and with long discussions of what's going on in his mind when he can no longer communicate, even. And it's absolutely amazing. Tolstoy could do that in a way nobody else did because he was obsessed with the question his whole life. I mean, and his own terror of mortality shaped that.
I believe he died tragically too, Tolstoy. He took his own life, I'm guessing. I heard.
No, he didn't take his own life. He for 30 years he had a conversion experience in roughly 1880, and he renounced all his, War and Peace and all his great works, and developed a very peculiar kind of Christianity that he believed in. He was a complete pacifist, a complete anarchist. Thought all sex simply ought to stop. I mean, all sorts of odd, things. He's a Russian, taken to an extreme, but he didn't live according to them, right? And he knew it. He knew it and regretted it, right? And towards the end of it, he decided he was going to live with him, and he went off, disguised as sort of a simple peasant, walk through the countryside and live, give up all his property, and he died along the way while doing that. Right? He was 82 by this point, right? He died. But he was escaping from the life that he himself didn't think he should be living. It's really fascinating, to read his story during these years. The story of Tolstoy's life and of Dostoevsky's life make fabulous reading. They're like novels themselves. You think this couldn't really be true, but it really was. So some of the biographies of these writers, are absolutely gripping, like a novel.
Yeah. So one more question, if I may. We've discussed Nietzsche before. Would the great minds of Russian literature view the decline and fall of Friedrich Nietzsche a tragedy or an absurdity?
The opinions differed. In the late 19th, early 20th century, they were constantly reading Nietzsche. They were constantly quoting him. He was a major figure. And, they had every possible, opinion about him. They were big Russian Nietzscheans, but their version of Nietzsche was not necessarily what you and I would recognize. And some there were. So, as I say, Nietzsche was already voicing things that were in, Dostoevsky, right, in Raskolnikov. You get almost every point of view you express, but it's really interesting that he became so important, and you identified the reason why, because he's asking some of those same questions, but giving a spin on them that Dostoevsky wouldn't give, right? That he is, let's repudiate all his Christian morality. Dostoevsky sees that that's the implication of a certain way of thinking and wants to say that's why we shouldn't do it. And Nietzsche wants to say it's why we should do it. So that's the argument that you wind up getting. And you get every combination, including, strangely enough, Christian Nietzscheans, which sounds like impossible. But this is Russia we're talking about. You get everything.
Well, on that note, thank you very much, Professor Gary Morson of Northwestern University, for joining the show.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been so much fun. Thanks for asking great questions.
Of course, everyone should check out his new book, Wonder Confronts Certainty, about how Russian literatures and their questions and how they answer them. Thank you again, and take care.